I used to believe the worst kind of betrayal a man could face was catching his wife in someone else's arms. I was wrong. That's just a bruise to the pride. The deeper wound comes when you realize she's not only stepping out on you, she's reaching for everything you've built. Your home, your business, the life you poured your sweat into. That's not a bruise. That's a bullet aimed straight at your ribs. Lauren and I, we were 20 years in. Henley Auto Supply started in a rented garage off Penn Avenue, back when I was selling brake pads out of cardboard boxes and she was handling the invoices from our kitchen table. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that felt like more than enough. We worked side by side, shared the same pot of coffee at 6 a.m., and fell asleep to the hum of freight trains in the Strip District. We dreamed together, and for a long time, we lived those dreams. There was laughter then, real, easy laughter. We'd sit at the counter in Pamela's Diner on Liberty Avenue, splitting a stack of hotcakes after a tough week. On Sundays, we'd take the incline up to Mount Washington, lean over the rail, and point out the streets we'd one day call our own. When business started booming, we moved into a house up there, view of the skyline, river bending below us like a silver ribbon. I thought we'd made it. But cracks, they don't start loud. They whisper. It began with late meetings. Not the kind where she came home with the smell of oil and dust from the shop, but the kind where her perfume lingered in the air a little too long. Calls that ended the second I walked into the room. Her phone, always face down on the table, like she was guarding it from sunlight. And the way she'd look at me when I asked about it. Not angry, just slow. Like she was picking the safest lie from the shelf. At first, I blamed the season. Pittsburgh winters have a way of pulling people inward. Days are short, skies are gray, and you find yourself holding your coffee a little tighter just to feel something warm. I told myself she was tired. I was tired, that it was just a cold patch in a long marriage. But there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a distance, sharp and deliberate. She wasn't just gone for a few hours. She was slipping away entirely, and I couldn't figure out why. Looking back, maybe I didn't want to figure it out. One night, late January, I came back from locking up the shop. Snow was coming down in lazy sheets, the city muffled under it. She was in the den, staring out the window toward the river, phone in her hand. When she saw me, she smiled, but her thumb slid over the screen so quickly it might have been muscle memory. I didn't say anything, just kissed her on the forehead, and felt her body stiffen before she eased into it. I told myself it was nothing. That's the thing about cracks. You pretend they're harmless until the whole damn wall caves in. What I didn't know then was that the first fracture had already run through the foundation of everything we'd built. And the ice in her eyes, that was just the first glint of the knife she was about to twist. It was a Tuesday afternoon in February when the first piece of the puzzle landed in my lap. Though at the time, I didn't know it was a puzzle at all. I was grabbing the ice scraper from Lauren's car before the storm rolled in. She'd left it parked out front, half blocking the driveway, like she was in too much of a hurry to bother pulling in. When I opened the driver's side door, I saw it sitting in the cup holder, a small black USB drive, shiny and clean, with a strip of masking tape across the top. Written on it, in neat block letters, was 3 words, Henley Auto Supply. My first thought was practical. Maybe she'd picked it up for me, or from the shop. But I didn't remember giving her any files to move. I slipped it into my pocket without much ceremony, just intending to ask her about it later. That same day, my accountant, Dave Callahan, called from his office on Grant Street. He's the kind of guy who doesn't waste words. 30 years of running numbers for Pittsburgh's small businesses will do that to you. Mike, he said, has someone new been added to your corporate documents? Somebody's been asking questions about ownership transfers. I laughed it off, told him it was probably just a vendor misunderstanding. But in the back of my mind, I felt it, that same little pull I'd been ignoring for months. Ownership transfers aren't something you ask about, unless you're planning a big move. That night, after dinner, Lauren went upstairs early, said she was tired, claimed her head hurt. I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up. Our house on Mount Washington is quiet after dark. just the hum of the fridge and the faint buzz of the furnace. I was rinsing the last plate when I heard it. Her voice, soft, low, coming from upstairs. I moved without thinking, my feet silent on the carpet. I didn't catch the start of it, just the tail end, sharp as a blade, making a clean break. There was a pause, the muffled sound of someone's voice on the other end. She laughed, not her real laugh, the one I knew from our years together, but a lighter, polished thing, like she was auditioning for a part. I stayed in the hallway, listening, my heart drumming in my ears. "Soon," she said. "He won't see it coming." She hung up after that. I stepped back before she opened the bedroom door, walked to the den like I'd been there all along. When she came down for water, her face was calm, almost too calm. She smiled, kissed my cheek, asked if I'd locked up the shop. And I answered like a man who hadn't just heard his wife plotting something in the dark. Later, in my home office, I plugged in the USB. I expected invoices, maybe some supplier contracts. Instead, I found spreadsheets. Detailed, color-coded, with tabs labeled ownership, transfers, and projected revenue. And at the bottom of one file, in her handwriting, the name of a corporation I'd never heard of. A shell company. The kind you set up when you want to move something valuable without anyone noticing. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat there in my chair, staring out over the lights of the city, wondering how far the crack in my life had spread and how much of it I'd been too blind to see. By the next morning, the unease had settled into something heavier. Not quite anger, not yet, but the kind of cold focus I'd felt only a handful of times in my life. That USB drive and her late-night call had moved the needle. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was real. I needed eyes that weren't mine. I called a number I hadn't dialed in years, Frank Delgado. Former Pittsburgh PD, now a private investigator with a reputation for getting the truth without wasting a single breath. I'd met him years ago when a supplier tried to pass off counterfeit brake parts to my company. Back then, he'd walked into the guy's office with nothing but a manila folder and a look that could cut steel, and 2 days later, I had my refund and an apology letter. Frank agreed to meet that afternoon at Mount Washington Overlook. The sky was overcast, the Monongahela a dark mirror below, the city laid out like a board game you could play if you knew the rules. He was already there, leaning against the rail, a paper cup of coffee steaming in the cold. "Mike," he said, his voice calm, low, the kind of tone that makes you think he already knows the answer to the question you haven't asked yet. "Tell me everything." I gave him the short version. The USB, Dave's warning, the late-night phone call. His expression didn't change, but I saw the way his jaw tightened when I mentioned clean break. "Who's your guess?" he asked. "I don't have one," I said, though deep down, a name was starting to rattle the back of my skull. A name I didn't want to say out loud. Frank nodded once. "We'll find out. But if this is what I think it is, she's not working alone." We planned the stakeout over the hood of my truck, like two guys mapping a hunting trip. Frank would set up in the Strip District, close to Hanley Auto Supply. I'd keep my routines normal, nothing to tip her off. He had a camera that could read license plates from half a block away, and the patience of a man who'd spent his life watching people make mistakes. 2 days later, I got the call. His voice was steady, almost casual. "Got something you're going to want to see." I drove down to his office, a cramped room above a locksmith on Carson Street. And there, on his monitor, was the footage. Lauren, hair pulled back, sunglasses on, walking into the grand concourse over in Station Square like she owned the place. And sitting at the corner table, waiting for her, was a man I knew better than I cared to admit. Ethan Cole, once my business partner, once my best friend. We'd built Hanley Auto Supply together, split the profits, split the headaches. Then he sold his share after a fight that left us both bleeding pride. He went into consulting, which was just his way of saying he'd get paid for ideas other people took the risks on. We hadn't spoken in 3 years. And now he was smiling at my wife across a table set for two. Frank let the video play. They shook hands, then leaned in close, their voices lost under the clink of glassware. She slid something across the table, an envelope. He didn't even open it, just tucked it into his jacket. I stood there, staring at the screen, feeling the last of my doubt burn off like fog in the morning sun. This wasn't just personal. This was business. And I knew Ethan well enough to know, if he was involved, it was going to get ugly. Still want me on this? Frank asked. I didn't look away from the screen. Frank, you don't stop until we've got the whole picture. And in that moment, I knew, whatever this was, it had just gone from a crack in the wall to a demolition job aimed at the foundation. Frank didn't waste time. By the end of that week, he had more than just a lunch date at the Grand Concourse. He had a map, a whole damn blueprint, of what Lauren and Ethan had been doing behind my back. And it wasn't just the kind of betrayal you can pin on a bad heart or a weak moment. This was deliberate, engineered. He spread the files across my desk in the office above our warehouse in the Strip District. Photos, bank statements, emails. You wanted the whole picture, he said, sliding a manila folder toward me. Careful, it's ugly. First, the business angle. Lauren had been feeding Ethan inside information, supplier contracts, cost sheets, shipment schedules, all under the table. I recognized my own spreadsheets in the printouts, ones that never should have left my desk. The kicker? Some of those numbers had been tweaked before they got to Ethan. Not to help him make a fair deal, but to undercut me, piece by piece. Then there was the personal smear. Frank pulled up a screenshot from Facebook, a private group Lauren belonged to with some of her old college friends. Posts about how hard it is living with someone who has a temper, vague little lines about being afraid to speak up. Frank looked at me. She's laying the groundwork. Divorce court eats this stuff up. I sat back, staring at the mess spread out in front of me. My wife wasn't just cheating with my ex-partner. She was rewriting the story of our marriage so that when the curtain came down, I'd be the villain. Frank poured 2 coffees from the pot in the corner, handed me one. Mike, this is a 2-pronged operation. One hand's emptying your pockets, the other's poisoning your name. I didn't answer. I just let the steam from the cup rise up, breathing it in like it might clear the fog in my head. You know what really gets me? Frank went on. They're confident. Real confident. The kind of confidence that comes from thinking you've got all the angles covered. I thought back to the way Ethan used to talk during our partnership. How he'd walk into negotiations like the deal was already signed, sealed, and framed on the wall. That smug grin, that lean back in the chair posture. And Lauren, she'd picked it up from him. Frank tapped one of the photos. Lauren and Ethan at Rivers Casino, Pittsburgh, sitting in the corner lounge, heads bent over what looked like legal papers. That's not a date, Frank said. That's a planning session. I felt something cold settle in my gut. All those little moments over the past year, the unexplained errands, the way she'd drift out of a conversation when I mentioned the business, they clicked into place. Frank gathered the papers back into the folder. Question is, he said, do you want me to keep digging, or are you ready to move? I took a long sip of coffee. Keep digging, I said finally. If this is the game they want to play, I need to see every piece on the board. Because now it wasn't just about stopping them. It was about making sure that when I hit back, there wouldn't be anything left standing. Frank called me 2 days later. His voice was flatter than usual, like he'd just come from a crime scene. Mike, you'd better sit down for this one. We met in his office again, rain streaking the windows on Carson Street. He closed the blinds before saying a word, then dropped a single sheet of paper in front of me. A news clipping, maybe 10 years old. Headline: Local entrepreneur dies in home accident. The man in the grainy photo was smiling, arms slung around a younger Ethan Cole. The caption said his name was Daniel Sutter, a partner of Ethan's in some real estate venture. According to the article, Sutter had fallen down a flight of stairs at his lake house. Instant death. Tragic, unexpected, and just days after finalizing a large life insurance policy naming Ethan as beneficiary. Frank's eyes narrowed. It was ruled an accident. No charges, no investigation. But I've seen this kind of thing before. Too neat. I stared at the photo. Ethan looked the same way he had when we were partners, smug, confident, already thinking 2 moves ahead. You're saying? I'm saying your wife's in dangerous company. And it gets worse. He slid another paper toward me. This one, far more recent. An insurance document, my name at the top, Lauren's signature at the bottom. Coverage, $2 million. Beneficiary, Lauren Hanley. I felt my stomach drop. When was this taken out? 6 months ago, Frank said. No mention to you, I'm guessing? I shook my head slowly. Frank leaned forward. Mike, they're not just playing games with your company. They're laying the groundwork for something that could end with you out of the picture entirely. Permanently. The room felt smaller. My coffee went cold in my hand as I pictured Lauren at the kitchen table, smiling while she signed those papers. All those nights, she'd told me to be careful driving home. Now they didn't sound like care. They sounded like inventory management. I thought about Ethan, about that old newspaper photo. One partner dead, a big payout. And now, here I was, her husband, with a business they wanted and a policy they could cash in if I happened to disappear. Frank's voice cut into my thoughts. I've seen people get sloppy when they think they're untouchable. Right now, they think they've got every angle covered. That's the only advantage you've got. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the rain tracing lines down the glass, thinking about patterns, how they repeat if no one stops them. Lauren thought she was writing the next chapter of her life. She didn't realize I'd just picked up the pen. 2 days later, the shock had cooled into something sharper. I'd stopped pacing the floors at night and started pacing the board in my head. By the time we sat down to plan our next move, the shock was gone. I wasn't pacing anymore. I wasn't second-guessing. The anger had cooled into something far more dangerous, control. Frank and I met late at night in the back office above the warehouse in the Strip District. The hum of the refrigeration units downstairs was the only sound, steady and low. He'd brought a battered leather briefcase, and when he opened it, the table between us filled with blueprints, legal forms, and a laptop already buzzing with activity. They've been meeting with a lawyer, Frank began, sliding a photo across to me. Lauren, Ethan, and a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper suit, sitting in a corner booth at Eddie V's on Grant Street. Name's Janet Brooks. Specializes in shell corporations, offshore accounts, and making things vanish without a paper trail. He tapped the photo with a calloused finger. This is the woman who's going to help them transfer Hanley Auto Supply into a holding company in Delaware. From there, the accounts get drained, the business gets sold for scrap, and they vanish. I stared at the photo, committing every detail to memory. Frank leaned back. The good news? That holding company doesn't exist yet. The paperwork's in draft form. They're planning to finalize it in person, somewhere they feel safe. That's where we hit them. I raised an eyebrow. How? He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. From the top, they looked like transfer agreements, the kind I'd signed 100 times for property or assets. But when I flipped through, I saw the truth buried in the fine print, a legal confession. Fraud. Conspiracy to defraud a business owner. Racketeering. All it needs is their signatures, Frank said. We get them to sign this thinking they're locking in their payday. In reality, they're handing us everything we need to bury them in court. The plan was simple, but it had to be perfect. We'd staged the final handover in my office, the one upstairs in the Strip District, where I kept the old conference table and a locked filing cabinet. Frank would plant cameras in every corner, hidden in smoke detectors, light fixtures, even the vent grills. Audio, too, so we'd have them on record discussing exactly what they thought they were getting. Timing was everything. Too soon, and they'd smell the trap. Too late, and the money might already be gone. Frank poured us both a cup of the burnt coffee from the machine in the corner. You're going to play it like you've given up, he said. Like they've won. Let them think they've broken you. People get sloppy when they think they've already crossed the finish line. I nodded slowly. I can do that. As we packed up for the night, I stepped to the window. The city lights were throwing long reflections across the wet pavement outside. Somewhere out there, Lauren and Ethan were probably feeling pretty proud of themselves. They had no idea that while they'd been building their net, I'd been weaving one of my own, and mine had no holes. Frank worked the office like a stagehand who'd seen 1,000 finales. By dawn the next day, every angle was covered. A pinhole camera in the smoke detector above the conference table, another nested inside the exit sign, a third tucked behind the slats of the HVAC return. Audio in the chandelier canopy, a backup mic inside the legal pad that would sit in front of Lauren. We tested each feed twice, then again, because almost wasn't good enough for what we were about to do. I'd spent the night drafting the bait. A short, tired email to Ethan and Janet Brooks from my Hanley address. I'm done fighting. Let's execute the transfer and be done with it. I added a line Lauren would find irresistible. I won't contest if funds clear by Friday. Frank read it, nodded once, and hit send from a relay that made it look like I'd typed it in that room at that moment. 10 minutes later, confirmed. Today for PM. A second ding. From Lauren, proud of you for being reasonable. I stared at those words until they blurred. We rehearsed. Frank played Ethan, leaning back in my chair with that lazy smugness I remembered too well. I practiced the walk-in. Not too early, not too late. Just as their pens touched the signature lines that weren't really transfers at all, but confessions dressed up in corporate language. My cue would be Frank's text, a single period. Nothing dramatic. Just a dot that said the trap had sprung. The setting mattered. That conference room above our Strip District warehouse had history. It still smelled faintly of axle grease and fresh cardboard, the same scent that clung to me when we were young and climbing. I replaced the framed photo on the credenza, me and Ethan in front of the first box truck, and angled it so the camera could see their faces when they noticed. I wanted that flicker, that quick calculation. Is he sentimental or weak? Let them pick wrong. We built an alibi hard enough to take a hammer. At 3:15, I'd be at Permane Brothers on Penn Avenue, shaking hands with a vendor, cameras and receipts to prove it. At 3:40, a door code change, for security, sent from my phone by Frank's scheduler, would force Lauren to text Ethan to meet her at the side entrance I forgot to update. That delay would push them into our window. Predictable people hate detours. They reveal themselves on the turns. Frank laid out the signatures where he wanted them. Lauren first, because she liked the control of going before the men. Ethan second, because his ego needed to approve. Janet would observe, cool as steel, and Tommy Rizzo, the casino go-between, would float in late with a courier envelope, because men like him only feel important when they arrive last. Every pen had a micro-ink that fluoresced under our lens. Every page had a unique watermark keyed to the time code. If anyone tried to retract, we could rebuild the act frame by frame. I walked the hallway 3 times, counting steps, feeling the tempo I'd hold when I finally came through that door. No stomping, no thunder. A steady entry, recorder visible in my palm. The simple confidence of a man who'd finally stopped bleeding and started thinking. I practiced the line in my head. Not a shout, not a performance. Just a verdict. Outside, the sky over Pittsburgh held that pale steel color you get before dusk, when lights wake one by one along Penn Avenue and forklifts hum in the alleys. I watched a barge drag itself along the Allegheny and thought about all the weight a thing can carry without sinking. Then I checked my watch. At 3:58, Frank killed the overheads and let the soft lamps glow, the kind of light people relax under. At 3:59, he slipped behind the partition with the monitors, 2 fingers raised like a conductor measuring a downbeat. I stood in the stairwell, hand on the rail, heart steady. My phone vibrated once. A single dot. The door opened. Laughter first, then the rustle of paper, the scrape of chairs, the clink of a pen against a glass. Their voices, easy and unguarded, filled the room I had built. And for the first time in months, I felt no anger, no panic, just the calm you get when the board is set and every piece is where you want it. All that was left was timing, and timing was mine. The conference room upstairs smelled faintly of coffee and that polished wood tang you only get from a table that's seen more deals than dinners. Through the cracked door, I caught fragments, the shuffle of papers, the soft click of a pen cap, Lauren's laugh. Not her old laugh, the one that came from deep in her chest, but the lighter, rehearsed one she used now when she wanted to make someone feel clever. Janet Brooks' voice floated through, crisp, precise, the tone of someone who bills by the minute. We just need signatures here. And here, initials on page 7. Ethan chuckled low. This is the cleanest deal I've ever seen. I stood in the stairwell, watching the seconds crawl across my watch face. Then my phone buzzed once, Frank's signal. The trap was closed. I pushed the door open slow, letting the hinges announce me before my voice did. All 4 heads turned. Lauren's pen froze mid-curve, the ink still glistening where her name stretched across the bottom line. Ethan's smile faltered, his body shifting back in the chair. I stepped inside, the recorder visible in my hand, my voice steady. You've just signed your own sentence. The air changed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Janet's eyes narrowed, scanning the page as if she could will the fine print to change. Tommy Rizzo leaned forward, his smirk gone, the pen he'd been twirling clattering to the table. Ethan was the first to break. He shoved his chair back hard enough to scrape the floor. What the hell is this? He reached for the stack of papers, but Frank moved faster, his hand pressing them flat to the table. His other hand rested near the edge, casual, but close enough to the small camera blinking inside the chandelier canopy. Lauren's mask cracked. Her mouth opened, then closed, her eyes darting between me, the recorder, and Frank. Mike, please. Even now, she was measuring which mask might save her, the wounded wife or the cornered conspirator. It was almost a whisper, but it wasn't apology, it was panic. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Every word they'd spoken today was already on record. Every detail of their clean break had been filmed from 3 angles. The documents they'd signed weren't transfers at all. They were confessions wrapped in legalese. Every clause a nail in their own coffin. Frank reached for his phone without breaking eye contact with Ethan. It's time. Outside, the faint wail of sirens began to rise, growing sharper with every passing second. Lauren's breathing quickened. Tommy cursed under his breath. Janet sat perfectly still, but her knuckles whitened around her pen. I looked at Lauren once, not as my wife, not even as the woman who'd tried to gut my business, but as the last piece in a puzzle I'd been putting together for months. Her face had none of the warmth I remembered, only calculation and the sudden realization that she'd miscalculated. The sirens grew louder, until they cut off right outside the building. Boots hit the pavement. Doors slammed. They thought they had me cornered, I said, more to myself than to them. They just didn't see the walls closing in. And then the first knock hit the door, hard. The knock came like a verdict. 3 sharp raps, followed by the heavy swing of the door. 2 Pittsburgh PD officers stepped in first, their presence filling the room. Behind them, a pair of detectives moved with quiet efficiency, their eyes sweeping over the table, the papers, the people. Lauren's chair scraped back an inch. This is a mistake, she started, her voice brittle. The female detective didn't even look up from her notepad. Ma'am, please remain seated. Ethan tried for bluster. You don't know what you're walking into here. He reached for the documents again, but Frank shifted just enough to block his arm, his stance easy, like he'd done this 100 times. Sit down, Ethan, he said, and for the first time in years, I saw my former partner actually hesitate. Tommy Rizzo's phone lit up on the table. One of the officers scooped it up before he could touch it. Janet Brooks didn't move at all, just folded her hands in front of her, her face unreadable. She knew enough not to fight the current. Lauren turned her eyes to me then, wide and pleading, the practiced mask of someone who still thinks she can talk her way out. Mike, please, you don't have to do this. We can fix this. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at her long enough to let the memory of who she'd been interfere with what she was now. The evidence would speak for me. Cleaner, colder, and without the risk of my voice cracking. The officers moved with practiced rhythm, gathering documents, photographing the table, cataloging each pin and envelope. The cameras Frank had hidden caught it all, From the moment Lauren's signature hit the page to the second the evidence bag sealed. As they cuffed Ethan, he twisted toward me. "You'll regret this." I met his glare with nothing but stillness. If he wanted fire, he'd have to bring his own. Mine had burned out weeks ago. Lauren's turn came next. She didn't fight, but she talked. A stream of words that slid from begging to bargaining to outright threats. "You think this is over? I'll tell them about you, about everything. You won't walk away clean." I stood by the window, watching the reflection of the flashing lights bounce off the wet pavement in the Strip District. Her voice became background noise, like a distant radio you forget to switch off. Every word was just another crack running through what was left of her story. Frank came to stand beside me. "You good?" he asked quietly. "Better than I thought I'd be," I said. Out on the street, they loaded them into separate cruisers. The doors shut with that solid, final sound that only comes from reinforced steel. The lights bled red and blue across the brick walls as the cars pulled away. I stayed at the window until they were gone, the hum of the city returning to its usual rhythm. Trucks down on Penn Avenue, the faint clatter of a freight train somewhere toward the river. Inside, the conference room was still warm from the body heat and tension, but the air already felt different. There was no satisfaction, no victory rush. Just the knowledge that I'd done what had to be done. The rest would be handled by people whose jobs didn't require them to bleed for it. I picked up the pen Lauren had dropped on the table, turned it once in my fingers, and set it back down. For months, she'd been writing the story of how she'd take everything from me. Now, someone else would write her ending, and I wouldn't need to read it. 3 weeks later, the world was quieter. The bank accounts Lauren and Ethan had been circling like vultures were frozen solid. Hanley Auto Supply kept running without a hitch, shipments going out on schedule, the crew in the Strip District whistling over their work like nothing had happened. To them, it was business as usual. To me, it was proof that the damage they'd tried to do had been stopped before it could touch the foundation. The Allegheny County Courthouse became my new backdrop for a while. Beige walls, echoing hallways, the low hum of voices carrying stories no one outside those walls would ever fully hear. I saw them both there, once. Ethan in an ill-fitting suit, jaw tight, eyes avoiding mine. Lauren in a dress that looked like she'd picked it to remind me of better days. It didn't work. Whatever history we'd shared had been stripped down to cold facts on paper and exhibits marked in red ink. Frank kept me updated in short, clean sentences. Evidence is airtight. Prosecution's confident. They're trying for a deal, but it's weak. He never once said congratulations. That wasn't his style, and it wasn't mine anymore either. At night, I'd stand at the Mount Washington overlook, the city spread below in a web of lights and moving steel. I'd think about how close I'd come to losing it all, not just the company, but the sense of who I was. Betrayal has a way of hollowing a man out if he lets it. But I hadn't let it. I played it slow. I played it patient. And when the moment came, I'd taken the board. Lauren had wanted me empty. Ethan had wanted me humiliated. Instead, they were the ones stripped bare, accounts seized, reputations poisoned, their plans laid out for the world to see. They thought they were the ones playing chess, moving quietly, setting traps, thinking 3 steps ahead. What they didn't know was that I'd already seen the endgame, the moment the cracks they'd made in my life turned back on them. And when you know how the game ends, every move in between just becomes part of the story you let them tell themselves. I turned away from the overlook, the wind off the river carrying the faint sound of a train somewhere far below. The city kept moving, the lights kept burning, and Hanley Auto Supply would open on time in the morning. Some games you win by force. Others, by letting your opponent walk themselves into a corner. This one, I'd won the moment I stopped reacting and started planning.